I'm gonna do a quick rundown on digging into the suspension on the Honda Beat.
Before you even start tearing into anything, you're gonna need to get the car up in the air. The frustrating thing with the Beat is there's really only 3 spots to get under it with a jack or a jack stand. One is gonna be here on the subframe, and then on each side of the chassis, you'll see these little hooks, tow hooks, and what I'm doing is I'm putting a jack stand under each of these after using the hydraulic jack here on the subframe.
One important safety thing to remember real quick before we get into it is this is not a 5,000 pound car. This is not some Ford F-150 you can throw up on the jacks and start torquing on. If you go trying to loosen some of these suspension bolts, you're liable to push this thing right off the jack stands. It weighs 1,600 pounds. So be careful, especially when you're getting out of this thing. Chalk the wheels, because the back end's up in the air. Just be safe. All right, now that you got the wheel off, you've officially run into your first problem, which is this son of a bitch castle nut. Now, the first time I went to pull this thing off, I was literally spinning the entire brake rotor with the car on the brake booster active and the brake pedal fully down. This thing will fight you, and that brake pad is not strong enough, in my experience, to stop the whole rotor from spinning. So, you're gonna have to get a little creative. What I would recommend is, if you've got the 93 stock wheels like I do, or you have some sort of wheel that's got the hub center cap in the wheel, what I would recommend is pull that center cap out, drop the car back down, put the wheel back on, drop it, and try and loosen the hub castle nut with that strategy, because this thing will fight you. Before you go psyching yourself out trying to figure out which way this nut spins, since it's an axle nut, I found that on the right side of this car, the nut does loosen counterclockwise and tighten clockwise, and I would imagine on the left side it's reversed. Before you get to that though, the hub nut does have a little ridge here, which part of the nut will be hammered into. That's to keep it from rotating. It's a safety measure. Most capsule nuts are going to have a pin through them to keep them from rotating. This one, you just hammer it down. So what I found to be the best strategy to get rid of this problem is to take a pair of vice grips, hold on to a nail, and hit the nail into the slot right here in the axle. That should bend the rim of the nut out far enough for it to spin freely. Now, since this is not the first time that this nut has come off in the last week, it's gonna be a lot easier for me to get it off with just this 2-foot breaker bar. Good luck with this son of a bitch, but I'm gonna give it a go. Yeah, 1/2 inch, by the way. I don't got the good stuff either. All right, now here comes the fun part. We got the axle nut off. Now, to actually, what I'm trying to do is get the CV axle out, but to get in here, we're really only gonna need to undo 4 bolts. So we got this 12mm bolt clip for the brake line. Right here is the shock squeeze clamp bolt. That's a 14mm. Got a 19mm nut back here on this rear control arm, and there is a 17mm through bolt on the back of this trailing arm. All right, I just loosened these 4 with a socket wrench, so let's go ahead and pop them off. That's the nut. Next, the trailing arm. The shock clamp. I'll get this with a ratchet. All right, now that you got all the bolts off that you need, a couple of things I'd like to state first. For one, when this caliper hub assembly does drop, you don't want it to be resting all of its weight on this brake line. So I've got something right here to set the rotor on once this thing pops off. But before that happens, these suspension arms actually have to come off of the hub. Now the through bolt on the trailing arm is already out. This should just pop straight down with a hammer. The part that you're gonna run into a problem with first is this rear control arm does not like the angle that it has to come off at. You're gonna be having to pull towards the back of the car from one side, push the hub forwards of the car with the other, because it's on a threaded bolt right here. It's kind of a pain in the ass to slide the bushing and everything off of this bolt coming out of the hub. So that's not gonna be fun. And then once you've got these two arms off, the only thing supporting the hub at that point is the lower control arm and the shock tower. And should just be able to hammer the hub clamp squeeze part right off the shock tower, and then it should just drop. And then it'll be swinging by the lower control arm with just the brake line pulled in place. That's why we have something to set it on when we eventually get it off. All right, let's see if we can't get that trailing arm off with a quick pop. All right, if you got back problems, this might be a good time to look away. So what we're gonna have to do is pull on this rear control arm and push the hub away at the same time. And it's not gonna wanna go. So we're gonna give that a shot. I think it's time for a hammer. So what I ended up deciding on to get this rear control arm off, so I'm gonna take this pry bar, I'm gonna place it here, but instead of pushing straight on it against this thin little brake shoe, I'm gonna take a socket and place it between the rotor and the arm of this pry bar. Let me give that a shot. All right, now this thing's basically ready to drop. We just got to hammer on the top of the shock clamp until the clamp slides the rest of the way off of the shock, and then it should just be free floating after that. So we're gonna go ahead and hold it with the, hammer it with one hand and hold it with another. Yeah, that's loud. I'm gonna spare you the banging. All right, we hammered the shock tower the rest of the way off the hub. So we got our trailing arm, rear control arm, shock, and then we got the hub hanging more or less. It's still under tension because the CV axle's all the way in it, but once we pop that out, the weight of this rotor is just gonna drop on this brake line, unless we don't block it up with something. Popping the axle out of the hub's gonna be simple. We're just gonna tap it with a hammer a couple times. Should drop. Maybe let's get a hammer that'll actually fit. Alright, we got the axle separated now. I'm holding most of the weight of this thing. I'm gonna try and get the axle just completely out of the hub in one go. Try not to put too much force on that brake line at any point. So this is what we got. Got the axle now out of the hub. At this point, the only thing holding the hub onto the car still is a bolt through this lower control arm. All right, let's get to the goal of this particular video, which is actually to change a CV boot. To do that, I choose to take the whole CV axle out, because getting the outer housing, outer CV bearing housing off is a pain in the ass. It's easy to just pull the whole thing out of the transmission and completely tear down the inner CV bearing. So that's what we're gonna do. Anyways, holding the entire axle into the differential is actually just one little clip. You just hold spring tension in there. So if we pull hard enough on the axle, it should all just pop straight out. Now you got two ways to do that. Either you can pull hard enough on the axle itself until it pops out, or you can do the smart thing, which is take a pry bar against the diff and gently pop the inner CV housing off of the differential, revealing the splines. We're not gonna do the smart thing. Easy. I'll get you a good look of where the axle actually enters the differential. You can see there is supposed to be a seal right here. I believe that's what it looks like. I am not an expert, but I'm pretty sure that this plastic piece right here is actually a seal which keeps the transmission fluid in. But this is what you're looking at once that axle comes out. That's where the inner CV housing rests, right up against the differential right here. All right, here's one more quick look at your axle. With this being the inner housing, this is that spring clip I was talking about, which holds inside the differential. There's splines at the inside, inner housing, boot, axle, outer boot, outer housing, outer splines. This is where the hub sits, hub nut. All right, in terms of tools for getting this housing off so that you can access the bare axle, and then replacing the boot, reassembling, disassembling, reassembling the bearing inside, replacing the grease. I assume since you're messing with a CV axle, you've already got your new CV boot kit. So I got my new CV boot right here. Don't even bother trying to find a CV boot that fits a Honda Beat. You're not going to. I got these universal joints right here. They should fit well enough. I'm just gonna cut along here because this 70 millimeters right here, 70 millimeters on the outside of each housing, and the axle is 24 millimeters, I think. Anyways, this universal should fit on there nicely. In terms of tools, you're gonna want some of these hose clamp crimpers. These are designed specifically for these boot clamps. Pair of pliers just for general use. I've got a pick tool here so that I can pick and pry at certain bearings or clips. Got this little nifty tool right here. This is for removing circlips, which you are going to have to deal with when working with this axle. If I were you, I would take some paint. Doesn't matter what paint, it's not gonna tear anything up, or whatever kind of paint you get in here, but I've got some paint which I'm going to use to mark the splines and try and mark which specific bearings come out of which part of the race, the cage, and how the race and the cage go on together. I'll explain all that. Just remember how this thing comes out. Don't just take it off and immediately start tearing stuff up and losing bearing balls and stuff everywhere. Make sure that once you pull this housing off, you're taking note of where each bearing ball goes, how the race orients on the cage, which direction it faces, because it is asymmetrical in here. I'll show you in a sec. Just make sure you're taking note of everything so that it all goes back the same way. It's gonna save you potentially some trouble. So I've got this paint that I can use to mark that. But you should have the grease and the boot and the clamps with the kit that you buy. For extenuating circumstances, I am actually out of the grease that came with my boots because I've had to rebuild this thing a couple times. So maybe I'm not the best voice on this issue, but I'm just trying to show you, maybe not necessarily how it's done, but how I've done it so that you can judge for yourself whether it's a job you want to do. I got some grease here, got my boot. I'm probably gonna reuse these clamps, honestly, because I've cut so many off. Just making mistakes. I'm showing you my mistakes so that hopefully you won't make the same. But let's get to it. All right, so I've cut the old boot off of the inner CV joint. Now, getting this thing apart is really pretty simple, especially compared to the outer, which I wouldn't touch if you don't have to. Seriously, it's worth pulling this thing out just to not deal with it. But I will show you how simple this is. So to get the bearing out, there is a ring like this, just over or around 1/4 of an inch into the housing. This spreads itself against the inside of the housing and prevents any of the ball bearings from coming all the way out of their respective journeys inside the housing. So once you've got that off, the housing should just slide straight off. Here, I'll give you a little look in there. So the bearing slides in and out along this housing. Each ball sits in one of these channels, these journeys. I'll show you now the bearing. You'll see there is a circlip on the back. You'll pull this circlip off, and that will allow the bearing race, which is what connects to the splines, to slide off of the axle. This part here on the outside, this ring, is called the cage. So race on the inside against the splines on the inside of the bearing. Cage is the outside part. You've got your ball bearings, you've got 6 of them. These ride along inside the housing, and they apply torque as you rev the engine. So this should just pop off. I'm gonna pop the entire bearing out, disassemble it. We're gonna clean it with brake clean, because anytime your CV axle pops open, you run the risk of contamination getting inside. This is the point at which I would advise you start marking the bearing, just so that you can get it all back together the correct way. Whether you're taking out each individual ball bearing and setting them in a specific orientation, or using paint, I would use that pick tool that we just used to remove this clip. Don't lose these, by the way, and dip it in the paint, mark specific parts. We're gonna go ahead and take this thing off, disassemble it. I'll show you the disassembled bearing. Then we'll clean it with brake clean, replace the grease. Make sure you slide your boots on before you get anything tightened back up. And then we're gonna have ourselves an assembled CV axle. All right, I've gotten the bearing off of the axle. You do sometimes have to use a hammer. You just tap it. It's not gonna break anything. These things are designed to withstand a lot of force. Just make sure you're not significantly scoring up any part of the bearing with the hammer. Just gently, repeatedly tap the bearing off of the splines on the inside of the axle. Then I've used just a small flathead screwdriver inside the bearing to pop each ball bearing out. And now what we've got is an isolated bearing, race, and cage. To remove these two, to separate them, you turn about, what is that? 30 degrees, 60, I can't remember. And then you'll see that, was I doing that off camera? Anyways, that's your bearing. I got it marked. This is the end that was facing away from me. I got all these ball bearings, so I remember the way that it goes together. So you turn this 30 degrees, and the race comes out from underneath the cage. You'll see when I hold the cage at this angle, you can see that one end is slightly larger than the other. Now, I actually can't remember which way this thing came apart the first time I did this, but I believe the large end of the bell of the bearing cage goes into the housing and the small face sticks out. Anyways, you don't need to keep these things separate from long. Just remember how they go together. I guess it's not that important, but use some brake clean or whatever, paper towels, wipe the old grease off of these bearings, then go ahead and use a copious amount of your new grease as you're assembling the bearing. Slap it all back together. Make sure you get that boot onto the axle before you go, and your hose clamps. Boot and hose clamps on before you reassemble everything, because remember, we had to take this thing off in the first place to get the boot onto the axle. You can get those ones that clip back around the axle, but those aren't gonna last. So I'm gonna get to it, wipe these things down, get my new grease on there, throw it all back together. Should be simple.
All right, I guess it's about time we talked about why I just had to cut off a boot with 20 miles on it. And that was because on this inner CV housing, this clip right here, which holds the splines of the housing into the differential, failed to keep the CV axle from pulling out of the axle. I mean, from pulling out of the differential, which caused the entire CV axle to eject while I was driving down the road. So I believe that failed because this little ring was too compressed and weak to overcome the force of the housing pulling away from the differential or being pushed out from the differential. So just something that I noticed that you should maybe check before you put the axle back in is this little piece of metal here going to survive? Now I'm using a micrometer to test and make sure that this thing is going to stay big enough, wide enough to have a greater circumference than the diameter, greater diameter than the diameter of these splines, so that the ring stays engaged inside the differential. But it's just something to be careful of. All right, once you got your bearing reassembled and cleaned up, and your spline and your housing all cleaned up, ready to throw everything back together. Once you got your boot already on the axle, especially, you know, remember, face one boot one way. I imagine you're changing both at the same time. It's probably worth it. They're all, what, 30 years old for you now? So one boot facing one way, another boot facing the other. This one's still fine. I replaced it again 20 miles ago. But we'll have that facing that way. Getting ready to pack this bearing back down onto the splines. So should go most of the way down. For me, it goes most of the way down. I'm just gonna take a hammer and use the shaft of the hammer to gently pop the bearing the rest of the way down on. Okay. We'll take our circlip, get it prepped. Take our circlip pliers. Shouldn't be rocket science. There we go. Take your pick tool. Make sure you're getting this circlip all the way down. Maybe I'll use something better. Oh, I got it. Flathead. And just confirm that the circlip is in position. Sorry if my camera's not getting everything. Yeah, circlip looks to be in position, holding the bearing on. It'd be bad if that failed. Okay. Now you're gonna take your housing, slide it on, and I would say before you go throwing grease on it or doing anything in particular, just slide your housing on. You know, pop it a little bit. The balls don't really like going in there all that nicely, but just wiggle it around a little bit. Make sure it's not binding up, because see how mine's binding up a little bit? That is something that you have to deal with now, because if you throw a bound up axle back on the car where it doesn't want to go, it's going to vibrate. It's gonna rock, rattle, whatever the suspension. So if you are having your axle bind up like that, chances are it is because, like on mine, the bearing, race, and cage have a little bit of play, and they can rattle back and forwards on each other, maybe a millimeter. But as force is applied to one side, and the other side moves the opposite direction, it tends to put all the force of this circular rounded edge of this race on one particular point on the cage. It just likes to bind up. So maybe not the best bearing design ever. And if you do run into issues, make sure that you solve them before you throw everything back together and bolt everything down and get in the car like I did, and then realize,
why is my axle rattling up and down or moving up and down under acceleration or braking. It's an issue that needs to be solved now. So either you need to replace the bearing or polish it or modify it or bend it or screw with it, do whatever, have it rebuilt. The problem needs to be solved now because I don't think it's gonna go away on its own. So it looks like I got some work to do. All right, so it is now the next day. I ended up spending a few hours yesterday polishing and messing with that bearing, trying to get it to go together so that everything rolls correctly. What matters is that now there's nothing binding up anymore. That's important. But just a few things before we tighten down our boots and throw the axle back in the car. Number one, triple check your area. Make sure that you didn't forget that circlip or the ring inside the housing. Those have to be in there. As far as the boot and the boot clamps go, a couple things. Number one, make sure you're not over tightening the boot clamps. You don't need to torque them hard. There's not a whole lot of force trying to pull the boot off. So be smart with that because you can actually over tighten these things and crack straight through and tear the actual boot just with the force of the clamp. It's kind of sharp on the edges, so it can actually tear through the boot. So just be careful with that. Another thing is, if you want to really be smart about it, you might wait until you actually get the whole axle on the car and the car on the ground to tighten the boot clamps, because the axle sits in a specific spot. It can expand and contract, so there's there's a resting point for it. Basically, is what I'm trying to say. Because this thing can expand like like an inch and a quarter back and forth. So, for example, if you tighten the boot clamps down while the thing's fully expanded, and then crush the axle back down, it might end up pinching up your boot if you don't have enough room. So, just a few things to think about before you go mess with finalizing your axle. All right, now we're about ready to throw the axle in. Should be just as easy going in as it was coming out. You just gotta overcome a single ring clip here on the end of the axle. We just pop that into the diff. All right, got the axle in. Now it's time to feed it through the hub. Let's see the rear control arm. All right, last thing, the trailing arm. If you want to get your hydraulic jack out now and pop up on the rotor, see if you can't position the rotor or the hub all the way up on the shock. That might help you out a little bit. I'm torquing all these down, by the way, with a breaker bar. By the way, remember to come back in here and crease the end of this castle nut. Make sure it doesn't slide off if you don't torque it hard enough. Alright, well, that's all I can think of. Got it put back together. Hopefully it stays put back together and I don't fuck anything else up and have to come back and redo everything like the third time. But tried to illustrate the mistakes I made. Hopefully you won't make the same ones. Sorry, some of the clips were filmed in vertical aspect ratio, filmed on an iPhone. not very experienced making automotive videos, but hope the information got across. Hope it helped. Anything else you want to know? I might respond to comments. I honestly don't know.